I think Sonic Frontiers is pretty good, but because my previous video started with a couple of negative points, a lot of people seemed to make the assumption that I didn't like it. This time I'll be going into even more small details about the design of this game, covering content from the first 3 islands, including story elements and bosses this time. If you'd like to see future videos on Frontiers or any other Sonic game, all you need to do is let me know by watching this one. And if you'd like to help me make these videos, you can become a channel member by clicking the join button. Before I move into the new stuff, I think it's important I respond to the main criticisms of my criticisms from the first video, most importantly the pop-in issue. A lot of people said they haven't experienced pop-in issues to the degree that was in my video. Since I'm playing on PC, I wanted to make a point to show my specs to make sure my complaints about performance weren't disingenuous or lies by omission. Some have said that it runs better on more powerful hardware, but honestly after trying it myself it seems to run about the same. Here's the specs for the system I used to capture for this video by the way, though I will also use some of my footage captured on the less powerful PC from before. Honestly, I'd be surprised if you managed to tell the difference. Some people also seem to think I was in the wrong for even buying the game on PC, which is pretty ridiculous in my opinion. Yes, PC games are generally well less optimized for multiple reasons, but this is still a completely legitimate version of a product that Sega released. The last thing I want to respond to is the defense of the problems with this game because it had a small team and tight deadline. Now, I do get this. If the team behind this game really was made up of around 50 people, that is pretty impressive. But much like I said about Pokemon, if the developers don't have the time, workforce, or money to make a polished game, that isn't an excuse, it's the problem. And Sega can afford to fix this if they wanted to. Just because I criticize something doesn't mean I'm saying the devs were the cause. In fact, upper management are probably the cause of most things wrong with most games. All that said, the passion and hard work of the developers here absolutely shines through, and even as someone who hasn't completely kept up with the past decade or so of Sonic, it's clear in many ways this game was supposed to be a love letter to the series, with references to previous games and characters packed into the egg memos, and nods to even fairly obscure parts of Sonic's history in the lines he'll say every so often. Speaking of Sonic speaking, his mouth has some really weird stuff going on that you're likely to miss if you aren't looking for it. In general, you can tell Sonic was originally designed to be 2D. These days they have to use clever tricks to communicate his iconic look in 3D space, like how on the cover for Sonic and the Black Knight, his spikes all stick out sideways to give him that recognizable Sonic silhouette. In the case of Frontiers and other 3D games, Sonic's mouth being on the side of his face is a little awkward. To account for this, it always switches to whichever side of his face the camera's on. In cutscenes it's pretty well hidden, and in gameplay you're usually looking at the back of his head, but if you purposely try to take a look at his mouth switching sides, it is pretty funny. I already went over my thoughts on Sonic's model in the previous video, but I also think it's worth noting that he has a really nice subtle texture for his fur or smaller spines or whatever Sonic is made of. And another small but nice touch is how his idle animation changes throughout the game as he's affected by cyber corruption. It is a bit awkward how he runs around just fine and then suddenly snaps into one of these poses, but it serves as a good reminder of where you're at in the story. Another interesting but pointless detail you probably didn't notice is how the footprints work in this game. Whether it's footprints or bullet holes or something else, you've probably noticed most games allow a limited amount of detail like this to be loaded in at once, and once you cross that amount, some of them will start to vanish. You'd expect the footprints in Sonic Frontiers to work in a similar way, but surprisingly they don't. You can actually have as many footprints as you want and they'll never unload, but only when you start to get a certain distance away is when they'll start to fade. One of the most important parts of this game is that Sonic needs to feel fast. In large part this is achieved by just actually making him really fast, but there's some important tricks to support this effect. First of all, there's this sonic boom effect, which is actually more scientifically accurate than you might think at first. The temperature and pressure of air both drop when its speed increases, and this rapid change in density can actually bend light, causing an effect just like this. It's actually worth pointing out that there's 2 of these sonic boom effects as well, which again is scientifically accurate, as a sonic boom is actually 2 booms that happen in such quick succession that a human couldn't tell them apart. Then there's of course the motion blur, which is very important for communicating speed, and Sonic actually briefly moves further away from the camera. Having him move away from the player like this not only makes him feel faster, but also makes your surroundings easier to take in when moving so quickly. I also think the birds in Kronos Island are a great touch. It doesn't really make any sense that they can move at the same speed as Sonic, but they really add to the feeling of flying over the landscape like the wind, though they don't interact with the world very well outside of that, to be honest. That's enough of the smaller details for now though, let's move into some bigger stuff. The bosses in this game are super cool and their designs do a great job making them feel intimidating in comparison to Sonic. Most Titans have a black body and a white skull-like face, giving them a Grim Reaper-esque appearance. Their teeth are often the focal point of their face to make them look creepy and dangerous, and I particularly like how Giganto shows off his multiple layers of teeth to add to this effect. I can't help but wonder if there was some inspiration from Bleach here. To be fair, the Menos designs are nothing particularly unique, but they really give off the same feel as some of these bosses. What I can say for certain is inspired by anime though, is the ending of the third boss where Sonic slices the knight in half with his own gigantic sword. The developers themselves said this is inspired by Goemon from Lupin III, and yeah, the pause before this impossibly dense object is perfectly sliced in half is exactly something I'd expect to see from him. I mean really, tell me this isn't the coolest thing you've ever seen. I also love how the Knight Titan pulls that giant sword out of his head in the second phase. Super cool concept. Boss fights are such an important part of a game, and honestly in the Sonic games I have played I can barely remember any of them, but here the battles feel huge and epic. The massive size difference between you and the enemy makes them feel so powerful at first, as you have to scale all the way up their body, which just makes it all the more satisfying when Sonic goes absolutely sicko mode on these guys. I appreciate the shifty eye-looking things some of them have across their body. Their lack of eyes could risk their designs seeming less intimidating, but this way it still feels like they're well aware of their surroundings. The red lighting on these guys is a great effect too. It really helps make them feel like menacing machinery compared to the natural world around them. And the black and red color palette pretty commonly symbolizes evil, contrasting the blue and white in Sonic's design. Of course, the Sonic series is no stranger to color coding tropes like this, like how Team Sonic are all primary colors, and Sonic's design is made up of triadic colors, which are commonly used in character design. I also just wanted to show how when I touched the Chaos Emerald on Giganto's back, he disappeared, and the Supersonic model immediately loaded in for about a frame before it finally cut away to the cutscene. The Wyvern boss fight was probably my favorite. Instead of scaling its body, you run alongside it on this roller coaster of a path that mimics the twists and turns of its movement. There's some really cool composition in this segment, especially towards the end when you're above the Wyvern's head and the Chaos Emerald finally comes into view. Throughout most of the fights, the camera is zoomed out so you can clearly see how its body is moving to prepare you for incoming attacks, but every so often it zooms back in to serve as a reminder of how huge this thing is compared to Sonic. I also love how instead of being in a smaller area solely designed for this fight, we're quickly flying through the air above the map that you've been playing through this whole time. You get to experience these areas in a whole new way, which in my opinion makes the fights that much more exciting. Also, is this a reference to the Sonic movie? Moving into the UI of this game, I honestly don't have a ton to say. It fits the art style of everything else in the way that it looks modern and sleek, but lacking in any interesting style in my opinion. That said, there are still subtle things to appreciate here. The lock-on icon is extremely important, and the player needs to immediately see it in fast-paced situations. Because of this, when it loads in, the icon is much bigger than you might expect to grab your attention, and then shrinks to a more specific area so you know what you're locking onto. The same logic applies to this animation when picking up collectible items. They'll briefly float above Sonic's heads before disappearing. In such a fast-paced game, this is a great extra detail to clearly communicate to the player what it is that they picked up. I also really like the rainbow effect you get after picking up certain items or going through boost rings. It just looks really nice. Here's a small, completely pointless detail that you might have missed. The loading screen in this game actually subtly changes every time you make progress. At first it's a triangle, and each time you unlock a new area, a new side is added. Going with the digital theme of this game, I guess it's like a 3D model having extra polygons added as it becomes less primitive and more detailed. If you'd like to see more videos on Sonic Frontiers or any other game, leave a comment and consider becoming a channel member. If you'd like to improve your art for free, you can join the Learning to Draw Discord server, and you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. So that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.